call something a right doesn't make it a right. Some rights are wrongs, and we'll show that for 3 reasons. Firstly, that it's legally unjustified for states to enshrine legally actionable socio-economic rights. Second, it's practically vacuous. Third, my second speaker will show that it hinders social progress. We, of course, stand for education, healthcare, social assistance, water policies that he talked about. But we don't agree with their approach to enshrining legally actionable socio-economic rights to secure social progress. We think, in fact, it is our side which stands for the status quo in most countries across the world, from the United States to Indonesia, where governments work with their peoples to create general, adaptable policies that suit prevailing circumstances. Before I move to my constructive argument, I want to address their case by asking 2 questions. First of all, is their model reasonable? Secondly, do they help society? So let's look first at the idea of the model. And here, it's very interesting that what I want to talk about is a very set, constricted set of rights. They talked about housing, water, no thank you, and education. The problem is, rights aren't set in stone when you allow a court judicial process to take place, when you allow individuals to sue, when you allow judges to interpret. Most of the time, what happens is there's a challenging of the original rights that you set up, no thank you, and there's a massive expansion. That's why in lots of countries, including India today, when you look at things like the right to education, for example, there's an expansion from the original conception of just providing for basic primary and secondary education to providing, for instance, for university education as well. So we don't think it's as fixed as you say, no thank you. And in the second place, it's very interesting that they talk about loads of socio-economic issues without ever explaining to us why particularly socio-economic rights are necessary. Lots of countries already pursue socio-economic policies that have already worked to target inequality. Let's just look, no thank you, at the rise of the middle class in the Asian tigers like South Korea and Singapore without the pursuit of socio-economic rights. And we also need to dispel this idea that socio-economic rights somehow are fit this idea of access rights, which means you get immediate access. The point is, if governments don't have the money, don't have the ability to create reforms that are needed to push through things like water networks, like transportation policies, for example, no thank you, just giving people a right doesn't mean they actually get access. So we find it extremely hollow. Let's now talk about the second idea of helping society. But before I move on, yes?
If you do, can you please tell us why exactly you support the political rights already in many constitutions?
The big difference between political rights like my freedom of speech is that when I speak, I still let you speak. It doesn't diminish anything of me. The point is that when you instrument socio-economic rights, that means taking property away from someone else. That's a huge distinction that we think you failed to analyze in this debate. Yes, it's true. Let's move back to my point. They talked about sufficient basic conditions for everyone. The point is, they're not really talking about basic rights. If you listen to the language carefully, they talked about subsidized housing. Subsidized housing in terms of affordability, in terms of quality, and we think in these cases it's not really so basic anymore. Even in education, it's not just about the vote. It's about whether or not there's tertiary education in some other countries, as we talked about. So we don't think that's going to happen. And they bring us this idea of politics, and they talk about how politicians are always going to ignore the poor. First of all, that's ridiculous because the Hispanics and African Americans form extremely strong voting blocs already within the United States, such that Democratic and Republican strategists always have to concentrate their attention on these areas. Secondly, we think people are going to remember if politicians decide that policies are not going to help the poor. They're just not going to vote for them the next time. So improvements will be made, no thank you, in the interim. And in fact, we're going to say that their side has an obsession with equality which ends up with society leveling down rather than leveling up. Because sometimes, in order to develop a place, for example, you need to focus on city or core areas before you can branch out and support the rural areas as well. So we think their policy fundamentally doesn't look at what we need to do as governments worldwide. No thank you. Let's move now to my constructive material, which further crashes with their case. I want to talk about why it's legally unjustified. My thesis is that states should not enshrine legally actionable socio-economic rights because this undermines democracy. In democracies, policies must be formulated with the consent of the majority. Why? Because you want to maximize the welfare of society. To ensure, no thank you, that the will of the majority is respected, individuals must be shielded from state tyranny. That's why states can't trespass on individual liberties like the right to private property, and such prohibitions are known as negative rights. However, no thank you, socio-economic rights fundamentally ignore the will of the majority. So it's not about some kinds of minorities being oppressed as much as the whole society being oppressed in their case. Why? Because as positive rights that involve people laying claim to resources from others in society, no thank you, single plaintiffs can extort the property of others who don't consent to this. This happens with social security payments enshrined in South Africa's constitution in section 27C, which talks about how everyone has the right to access to social security payments. Hence, socio-economic rights are deeply undemocratic because they trespass on the majority's property rights. No thank you. Furthermore, enshrining legally actionable socio-economic rights allows the judiciary to usurp the legislature's power to allocate resources across society, and we think this fundamentally takes away from the people governing their own places. This is problematic for two reasons. No thank you. First, the judges are often unelected and they don't have the people's mandate. Second, there's a lack of consensus on many socio-economic issues like how much water we should provide, how much transportation we should provide. And we've seen conflicts against the democratic will. In Olga Talese, no thank you, versus Bombay Municipal Corporation, India's unelected High Court was able to use the socio-economic right to livelihood to stop the eviction of illegal squatters. This meant the democratically elected Bombay City Council could not build new flats for local residents, which they wanted. Hence, to ensure that democracy is affirmed through the will of the majority, states should not enshrine legally actionable socio-economic rights, and that's why we've answered the legal cases you brought up. Yes, ma'am?
Can you please tell us why you think that the rich in society have an absolute right to all of their profit when it's made from a system that exploits the poor?
They don't have an absolute right to that. There's a reason why there's taxation which is supported, no thank you, by the majority of society. The only difference is there's no consent when it comes to the socio-economic rights policy that you choose to talk about. We challenge the next speaker to explain why it's different. So let's now talk about why it's practically vacuous. Our thesis is that states should not enshrine legally actionable socio-economic rights because they hurt our welfare. Now, socio-economic rights, as they rightly point out, are definitive standards that states are going to be constricted by. This threatens long-term social policies that often involve short-term sacrifices that violate socio-economic rights. For instance, Margaret Thatcher's privatization of inefficient state enterprises like mining are now celebrated for pulling Britain out of the 1979 recession, but they also left in 1982 3 million people jobless. This was in breach of Article 6 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that claims we all have a right to full and productive employment. With legally actionable socio-economic rights, states won't pursue such policies, fearing the negative legal fallout. Furthermore, these rights prevent societies from undergoing the comprehensive reforms they need for long-lasting uplift and precludes socio-economic rights from being achieved themselves. So governments can't provide for the rights, even if courts force them to. This explains the tragedy of Irene Grootboom. Even though she won a case on the right to adequate housing against the South African government in 2000, she was still a squatter till she died in 2008 because the government didn't have money to build flats for them. Furthermore, socio-economic rights hurt society when they become legally actionable. Between 2000 and 2008, the 35-hour workweek mandated in France to guarantee jobs for all caused a 61% fall in the country's productivity growth rate. Hence, states should not enshrine legally actionable socio-economic rights because it maximizes societal welfare and because it's legally unjustified. I quote Nelson Mandela, who once told us, "Social problems don't just change because you have made a law."